Hello, I'm Dr. Luneta from the University of Johannesburg, and in today's lecture, it's basically a continuation of where we stopped last time. And in this lecture, which is on doing research in education, an honors research project, we'll look at issues that are pertinent to research. And in this particular lecture, we'll look at the problem statement, research questions, aims and objectives of a research. Now, you'd realize that in actual fact, when you are thinking about doing a research, the first thing that you will consider is to establish the problem statement, which is a declaration of what the problem is in your area of interest. And your problem statement will be an accumulation of issues that have been raised pertinent to the area that you would like to investigate. So it's usually an explanation of the problem and how it manifests itself in that particular field that you are interested in. You'd also realize that for you to establish the problem statement, it is important that you read in the field. So your literature will in actual fact open up the avenue of what the problem is in that particular area of interest. So a research problem, therefore, is developed from the literature that you read. So it becomes critical that as a researcher, you read in the field of your interest before you begin to dwell on whatever that you are going to think about in terms of writing a research statement. So the problem, therefore, will be a declaration of what you have seen in that area of interest that you would like to investigate. It, in most cases, is not really a question. It is just a broad outlook of that area that you are interested in. Now, let us take, for instance, if our area of interest at this point in time is children's misconceptions in dealing with some mathematical concepts. So my research, my problem statement, therefore, I would begin to read on how children learn and the issues that are coming out on the misconceptions that are being formed by the learners pertinent to the mathematics concepts that I'm looking at. So my reading, therefore, is going to help me to develop the issues and a comprehensive understanding in order for me to have a good outlook of what it is that is a problem in the area. The next part that we'll look at, therefore, is in actual fact trying to in this next slide, I've already identified an area that is a problem, and now would like to see what it is that I can how I would formulate questions in order to try and respond to that problem that the entire world education system is facing. So in a qualitative study, therefore, several research questions can be asked to collect data that attempts to address some of the problems created by the pandemic, for instance. So one of the questions that I would, for instance, pose is, what are the consequences of the disruptions created by COVID-19 to the primary school schooling in South Africa, and how best can the problems be resolved? So that is one way in which I would ask that question. So this, you'd see that it's one question, but it also has an extension to it. I have posed a question to address, that is, the consequences of the disruptions of COVID-19. And I've also said, because in research, you do not just look at a good research, that is, does not just look at what the problem is, but it also looks at how do we address the problem. In other words, what are the consequences of the disruptions of COVID-19 in the education system? Definitely, the year 2020 has been disrupted. So some of the consequences are that the year will be extended, it will not be the same anymore, and so on. So we need to research about that. However, that is not enough. We also need to think of how best then do we address the problem at hand. So that becomes one of the research questions. So these would be relevant, relatively good questions for a qualitative study. A qualitative study approach might have a hypothesis as well, rather a quantitative study. That's in quantitative studies, we usually have a hypothesis. That is a clear, testable proposition or tentative answer to one's research question. So in a quantitative study, a hypothesis is determined or is developed. And usually this is more or less as an answer, a pre-answer to the problem. So in this case, therefore, a hypothesis might be COVID-19 has disrupted the South African education system. So it is as if you are providing an answer to it, that I know COVID-19 has disrupted the South African education system. So in this quantitative study, therefore, we begin to see how best we provide information in order to certify this statement or satisfy this particular statement. So I'll again give you a few minutes to ponder over this slide. Okay, let's move on then. So we are still looking at what is a research question. So we have said in a quantitative research approach, we might have a hypothesis such as COVID-19 has disrupted the South African education system, or COVID-19 has had no effect on the South African education system. So these are two ways in which you can provide the hypothesis. It is, however, worth noting that the clearer your hypothesis or your research question is, the easier it tends to be to collect the data that responds to the question. So your research question has always got to be, in fact, the simpler it is, the better. Do not have a complicated, long, windy research question. Then it becomes difficult for you to actually, one, find ways of how to respond to it. Find ways of how to collect the data that assist you to respond to the question. So be as straightforward as you possibly can in the questions that you pose. So here I'm therefore saying that the easier it is, the most straightforward and the clearer your research question is, the easier it becomes for you to answer it. Research questions actually make or break the research project. That is important. So your research question will definitely determine whether you would be able to collect the data that you'd like to or not. So it's important that it is clearer to you, and therefore that's why I advise here that it's always better to talk to your supervisor about it. This is the research question I have posed because of this particular problem area that I've identified. What do you think? Talk about it to your colleagues and your supervisors. The chances are you will be able to have conversations around it, and as a result it will become much clearer, and you'll be able to formulate it in a way that becomes, one, answerable. So the suitability and appropriateness and the answerability of one's research questions is critical. It has got to be suitable, it has got to be appropriate, and it should be answerable. You should be able to find answers to it. Again, let me probably pause here for you to just look at this slide. Then let's look at how we develop our aims and objectives in qualitative research. First, we need to know what is an aim in a research. The aim of a research is the answer to the research question. So the answer to the research question really is the aim of that research project. It is the main goal or overarching purpose of the research. So if the question therefore is, what are the most prominent errors that learners exhibit when adding and subtracting multiple digit whole numbers? Okay, that is our research question. I think this is good. It's one of the, in fact, I've extracted this from one of my papers. What are the most prominent errors that learners exhibit when adding and subtracting multiple digit whole numbers? In other words, I have identified that learners do exhibit errors when they're adding and subtracting multiple digit whole numbers. What are these errors? So I need to find a way of capturing these errors. So that is my research problem. So if that is my research problem, therefore my aim would be as follows. The aim would be to, the aim to the above research question would be to identify the most prominent errors. That is the aim. The research question is what the errors are, and my aim is how I can identify them. So the aim to this, therefore, would be to identify the most prominent errors learners exhibit when adding and subtracting multiple digit whole numbers. That is simple and straightforward. That is the aim of my research project. When it's important, when the aims are achieved, then the research questions must have been answered, and the problem has been resolved, and the goal and purpose of the research has been established. So once we answer, or we are able to achieve the aim, then that means we have answered the research question. Why? Because the aim of the research question is to identify, in this particular instance, is to identify the prominent errors that learners make. And once I've identified that, then I have responded to the research question. What was the research question? It was to establish what the prominent errors are. And in my aim, I have identified them. Therefore, I have responded to the research question. So we need to have an understanding of what the aims are, and the aims become easier to establish if the research question is clearer and much more straightforward. So avoid complicated research questions. And the more complicated research questions are, the more difficult it is to determine the aims. And each research question should probably have one aim. In most research, actually, that's how it should be. So I always insist on students not to have so many research questions. Have one main question and maybe two sub-questions. And the main aim of the study would be an attempt to provide a solution to the research question. So then, each research question would have a single aim. We need to make sure that that is established. So let me give you again a few minutes for you to think about this. Okay, so then consider this. From this lecture, you should be able to think around this. After what we've talked about, you can go, you are able to go over your questions and answer the following questions. Is my research question answerable inquiry into a problem, task, or concern of an issue? In other words, think around your research question. Is it an answerable inquiry? In other words, can we provide an answer to your research question? If you think yes, if I collected some data, I should be able to indeed answer that, then that's okay. Then you're in the right direction. 2, think around what do you think is the aim of your research question? So formulate your research question. In most cases, you have already formulated your research question. Now try and develop a clear and straightforward aim for your research question. 2, try and attempt what an objective is to your research question. We have not discussed the objective of a study, but I would like you to read around that. That will be the part of our next lecture. However, try and think around how best you can establish, 1, your research aims. In fact, let's start with first the research questions. Then 2, develop an aim to that research question. If you are able to answer this question, then you are making progress in your knowledge of research. Again, remember, this is introduction. It's quite elementary, but the best you can do is read research books. I think I have highlighted some of them. There are lots of articles on research in education. In our next lecture, I'll provide an outline of some of the books that I have recommended, including some of my own books. If you Google Luneta Kakoma's book, some of my books will come up, especially one that deals with the teaching elementary mathematics. There's a chapter there that deals with introduction to research. Okay, I think that's the end of this lecture. Thank you very much. Goodbye.